The morning sun cast a golden glow over London as thousands of people gathered along the streets. Everyone was waiting for something special. Today was not just any day. It was the day of King Charles III's coronation, and the entire nation was buzzing with excitement. Inside Kensington Palace, the Wales family was preparing for one of the most important days of their lives. Kate stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her elegant ivory dress. The gown was designed by Alexander McQueen, featuring delicate embroidery that sparkled under the light. She wore a stunning headpiece made of silver leaves and flowers. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened her pearl earrings. This was a moment she had been preparing for, yet the weight of it all felt heavier than she expected. William walked into the room, already dressed in his formal military uniform. The red and gold fabric gleamed, and his medals hung proudly on his chest. He looked every bit the future king he was destined to be. When he saw Kate, he paused and smiled warmly. She always took his breath away, but today she looked absolutely radiant. In the children's rooms, organized chaos was unfolding. George, the eldest at 9 years old, was trying to tie his own shoelaces. His small fingers fumbled with the loops, and frustration crossed his young face. He was dressed in a dark blue suit with golden braiding, looking remarkably grown up for his age. George knew that today he had a special role to play. He would be one of the pages of honor, carrying his grandfather's robes during the ceremony. Charlotte, 7 years old, twirled in her white dress. Her hair was pulled back neatly with a delicate headband adorned with small diamonds. She giggled as she caught her reflection in the mirror. Charlotte loved dressing up, and today she felt like a real princess. She wore white gloves that reached just below her elbows and practiced her curtsy over and over again. Louis, the youngest at 5 years old, was the most energetic of the three. He bounced around his room, unable to contain his excitement. His nanny tried to keep him still long enough to button his miniature suit properly. Louis didn't quite understand the importance of the day, but he knew something big was happening. He kept asking when they would see Grandpa and if there would be cake afterwards. Kate moved from room to room, checking on each child. She knelt down beside George and helped him with his shoes. She could see the nervousness in his eyes. George was a serious child, often quiet and thoughtful. He felt the pressure of his position even at his young age. "You're going to do wonderfully," Kate whispered to him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Just remember to walk slowly and keep your head up. Grandpa will be so proud of you." George nodded, but his face remained tense. Kate recognized that look. She had worn the same expression many times before stepping into the public eye. She understood the burden he carried, even if he was too young to fully articulate it. William joined them, sitting down on the bed beside his eldest son. He placed a reassuring hand on George's back. Father and son shared a quiet moment, and William spoke softly about duty, family, and how they would all be there together. George's shoulders relaxed slightly, and a small smile appeared on his lips. The palace staff moved efficiently through the halls, making final preparations. The children's security detail reviewed their positions for the 100th time. Every detail had been planned and rehearsed for months. Nothing could be left to chance on a day of such magnitude. As the family gathered in the main hall, photographers were allowed in for a brief moment. The flashes were blinding, but the Wales family stood together with practiced smiles. Kate held Louis's hand tightly, knowing he might dart away at any second. Charlotte stood perfectly still, her posture impeccable. George stood beside his father, mimicking William's formal stance. The convoy of cars waited outside, polished to perfection. The streets leading to Westminster Abbey had been cleared and secured. Crowds had been gathering since dawn, waving Union Jack flags and holding homemade signs. Some people had camped overnight just to secure a good spot to catch a glimpse of the royal family. Inside the car, the family sat together. Kate kept glancing at the children, making sure their clothes remained unwrinkled. William stared out the window, watching the crowds grow larger as they approached the Abbey. He felt a mixture of pride and solemnity. His father was about to be crowned king, and one day he would sit on that same throne. Charlotte pressed her face against the window, amazed by the sheer number of people. She waved enthusiastically, and the crowds roared with delight. Louis copied his sister, waving both hands wildly. George remained more reserved, offering only small waves and polite smiles. The journey seemed to pass in both an instant and an eternity. Kate's mind raced through all the protocols they had learned. She mentally reviewed each step of the ceremony, each bow, Each moment they would be in the public eye. She had done this before many times, but today felt different. Today, the world was watching more closely than ever. As Westminster Abbey came into view, the magnificence of the ancient building took everyone's breath away. The Gothic architecture stood proud against the blue sky. Flags from different nations decorated the entrance. Camera crews from around the world had set up their equipment, ready to broadcast every moment to millions of viewers. William squeezed Kate's hand. She looked at him and saw the same determination she felt within herself. They were in this together as they had always been. Their partnership had weathered many storms, and today they would face this monumental occasion as a team. The car slowed as they approached the Abbey. The roar of the crowd grew louder. Kate took a deep breath, steadying herself. She looked at each of her children, memorizing their faces in this moment. They were so young, yet already part of something so much bigger than themselves. Louis tugged on her dress. "Mummy, are we there yet?" he asked innocently. Kate smiled down at him, her heart swelling with love. "Yes, darling. We're here." The car came to a complete stop. Outside, the world waited. Inside, the Wales family shared one last private moment together before stepping into history. William straightened his uniform one final time. Kate adjusted Charlotte's headband. George took a deep breath, preparing himself for his important role. The door would open any second now, and their entrance would be captured by thousands of cameras. But for this brief moment, they were just a family, supporting each other through something extraordinary. William looked at Kate and she nodded. They were ready. The door handle clicked and the sound of the crowd rushed in like a wave. The door of the car swung open and a royal aide stood ready to assist them. The noise from the crowd was overwhelming at first. Thousands of voices cheered, cameras clicked rapidly, and somewhere in the distance a band played. William stepped out first, his military boots touching the red carpet that had been rolled out especially for this day. He turned back and extended his hand to Kate. She emerged from the car with grace that seemed effortless, though her heart was pounding. The sunlight caught the details of her dress and the crowd gasped in admiration. Kate's smile was warm and genuine as she waved to the people who had waited hours to see this moment. George came next, carefully stepping down with the help of a staff member. His face was serious, focused on not making any mistakes. He had practiced this entrance dozens of times, but doing it in front of thousands of people was entirely different. His small hand gripped the car door for just a moment before he let go and stood tall beside his father. Charlotte practically floated out of the car, her natural confidence shining through. She had been looking forward to this day for weeks. Unlike her older brother, Charlotte seemed to thrive under attention. She gave a small wave to the crowd, and people's hearts melted at the sight of the young princess. Louis was the last to emerge, and he did so with typical 5-year-old unpredictability. He jumped down from the car with more enthusiasm than elegance, causing Kate to reach out quickly to steady him. He looked around with wide eyes, seemingly amazed by everything he saw. The crowd laughed affectionately at his childlike wonder. A palace official approached them, speaking quietly to William. It was time to make their way into the Abbey. The family formed a line with William leading the way. Kate walked beside him while the children followed in order of age. Palace aides and security personnel surrounded them, but stayed at a respectful distance. The walk from the car to the Abbey entrance was only about 50 meters, but it felt like a mile. Every step was photographed from multiple angles. News commentators around the world described every detail of their appearance. Social media was already exploding with posts about Kate's dress and the children's adorable expressions. George walked with careful, measured steps. He kept his eyes forward, remembering his father's advice. His hands were clasped in front of him, and despite his young age, he carried himself with remarkable composure. Inside, his stomach was doing flips, but outside, he looked every bit the future king's eldest son. Charlotte walked with a slight bounce in her step. She couldn't help but feel excited by all the pageantry. She had always loved the formal events, the beautiful dresses, and the sense of occasion. As they walked, she noticed her grandmother Carol in the crowd and wanted to wave, but remembered she needed to maintain her composure. Louis held tightly to his mother's hand. He kept looking up at her for reassurance. The crowds were much louder than he had expected, and it was all a bit overwhelming for someone so young. Kate squeezed his hand gently, letting him know she was right there with him. As they reached the entrance of Westminster Abbey, the temperature seemed to drop. The ancient stone building had stood for nearly 1,000 years, and within its walls countless monarchs had been crowned. The history was palpable, hanging in the air like morning mist. Inside the abbey, the atmosphere was completely different. While outside had been loud and bright, inside was hushed and solemn. The vaulted ceiling stretched high above them, and colored light streamed through the magnificent stained glass windows. Rows of wooden pews were filled with dignitaries from around the world, all dressed in their finest attire. The children's eyes grew wide as they took in the grandeur. Charlotte gasped softly at the beauty of the flowers that decorated every corner. Thousands of blooms in white, gold, and purple created a stunning display. The scent was heavenly, mixing with the ancient smell of the stone building. An usher guided them to their designated seats. They were positioned in a place of honor, close to where the coronation ceremony would take place. Kate helped the children settle into their seats, making sure their clothes were arranged properly. She smoothed down Charlotte's dress and adjusted Louis's collar one more time. George sat very still, his eyes fixed on the throne at the front of the abbey. That chair, the coronation chair, had been used for over 700 years. His grandfather would soon sit there, and someday his own father would too. The weight of that realization sat heavy on George's young shoulders. Other members of the royal family began to arrive. There were aunts, uncles, cousins, and extended family members that the children rarely saw. Louis perked up when he spotted some familiar faces. He wanted to call out to them, but Kate placed a gentle finger to her lips, reminding him to stay quiet. The abbey continued to fill with guests. World leaders, celebrities, and representatives from various charities took their seats. Everyone who was anyone seemed to be there. The air buzzed with quiet conversation and anticipation. Security personnel stood at attention throughout the building, their eyes constantly scanning for any potential issues. William leaned over to speak quietly with Kate. They discussed the timing of when George would need to move to his position as a page of honor. Kate checked her watch discreetly. Everything was running on a tight schedule, and there was no room for error. Charlotte noticed a famous actress sitting several rows away and tugged on her mother's sleeve to point her out. Kate smiled and nodded but redirected Charlotte's attention to the front. It was important that the children understood the seriousness of the occasion, even while appreciating its grandeur. A hush fell over the crowd as the organ began to play. The deep, resonant notes filled every corner of the abbey. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the building. This was the signal that the ceremony was about to begin. George's moment was approaching. Soon he would need to leave his seat and take his place with the other pages of honor. William gave his son an encouraging nod. Kate reached over and squeezed George's hand one more time. The young prince stood up, his legs feeling slightly shaky, but his determination was clear. As George made his way to his position, Kate felt tears prick at her eyes. Her firstborn child was taking on such an important role. She was incredibly proud of him, but also acutely aware of how young he still was. She wanted to protect him from the pressures of royal life, yet she knew this was part of his destiny. The music swelled, and the processional was about to begin. William reached for Kate's hand, and she held on tightly. Charlotte sat up straighter in her seat, craning her neck to see everything. Louis fidgeted slightly but remained relatively calm thanks to a small toy car Kate had secretly slipped into his pocket as a distraction. The moment everyone had been waiting for was finally here. The great doors at the western end of the abbey opened, and a golden light seemed to pour in. The congregation rose to their feet as one, the sound of hundreds of people standing echoing through the ancient building. The organ music reached a crescendo that made the air itself seem to tremble. Kate felt goosebumps rise on her arms as the procession began. First came the clergy, dressed in ornate robes of gold and white. They moved slowly, deliberately, carrying sacred items that would be used in the ceremony. Behind them, members of the royal household carried regalia on velvet cushions. The imperial state crown, the sovereign's orb, and the scepter with the cross all gleamed under the abbey's lights. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. King Charles and Queen Camilla appeared at the entrance. Charles wore the crimson velvet robe of state, trimmed with ermine fur. The train of his robe stretched behind him for several meters. This was where George and the other pages of honor had their crucial role. The young boys, all dressed identically in scarlet and gold uniforms, carefully held the edges of the heavy train, ensuring it didn't drag on the ground. Kate's breath caught in her throat as she watched George. He was so focused, so serious. He kept his eyes on the train, making sure he was doing his job perfectly. His face showed such concentration that he looked years older than his actual age. William watched his son with visible pride, his chest swelling with emotion. The procession moved slowly up the nave of the abbey. Every step was measured, every movement choreographed to perfection. The choir sang in Latin, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to come from heaven itself. Charlotte was mesmerized by the music and the spectacle. She had never seen anything quite like this before. Louis, however, was starting to struggle with sitting still. He swung his legs back and forth, his shoes not quite reaching the floor from his seat. Kate placed a gentle hand on his knee, trying to calm him. She pulled out the small toy car from his pocket and let him play with it quietly. William glanced over and gave her an appreciative smile. Parenting during a coronation was no easy task. As Charles and Camilla reached the front of the abbey, they took their positions. George and the other pages carefully arranged the train of the king's robe, making sure every fold was perfect. George stepped back into his position, relief washing over his face. He had done it. His part was complete, at least for now. The Archbishop of Canterbury stepped forward, his voice clear and strong as he began the ceremony. The words he spoke were ancient, used for centuries at coronations past. He talked about duty, service, and the sacred responsibility of the monarchy. Kate listened intently, knowing that these same words would one day be spoken for William and eventually for George. The ceremony was deeply religious, filled with prayers, hymns, and blessings. Charles knelt before the Archbishop, his head bowed in humility. The congregation watched in silence as sacred oil was used to anoint him. This was the most holy part of the ceremony, so private that a screen was briefly placed around the king to shield him from view. Charlotte whispered to her mother, asking what was happening. Kate explained quietly that Grandpa was being blessed and anointed, making him officially the king in the eyes of God and the church. Charlotte nodded, trying to understand the significance of it all. When the screen was removed, Charles was dressed in new robes. The golden super tunica sparkled brilliantly, covered in intricate embroidery. Over this he wore the imperial mantle, a massive golden cloak that seemed to glow in the light. He looked transformed, no longer just a man but a symbol of the nation itself. The moment came for the actual crowning. The Archbishop lifted St. Edward's crown high above his head. The crown was solid gold, encrusted with precious stones and incredibly heavy. A hush fell over the entire abbey. Outside on the streets of London, people fell silent, watching on giant screens. Around the world, millions held their breath. The Archbishop lowered the crown onto Charles's head. As it settled into place, trumpets blared, bells rang throughout London, and gun salutes fired across the nation. Inside the abbey, the congregation called out, "God save the King," 3 times. The sound was thunderous, echoing off the stone walls. Charlotte jumped slightly at the sudden noise. Louis covered his ears, startled by how loud everyone was shouting. William and Kate joined in the proclamation, their voices adding to the chorus that declared Charles as the rightful king. Camilla was then crowned as queen consort. Her crown was different, lighter, and adorned with diamonds that caught the light beautifully. She looked elegant and composed, though Kate could see the emotion in her eyes. It was an overwhelming moment for everyone involved. The ceremony continued with the presentation of the royal regalia. Charles was handed the sovereign's orb, a golden sphere topped with a cross symbolizing Christ's dominion over the world. Then came the scepter with the cross, containing the largest clear-cut diamond in the world. Each item was presented with great ceremony and deep meaning. George watched every detail carefully. He was learning, absorbing everything he saw. One day this would all be part of his own life. The thought was both exciting and terrifying for the young boy. He glanced back at his parents, and his mother gave him an encouraging smile. The religious portions of the ceremony were interspersed with magnificent music. The abbey's choir sang pieces composed specifically for this coronation, along with traditional hymns that had been sung at coronations for hundreds of years. The music swelled and filled the space, adding to the emotional intensity of the moment. Kate found herself thinking about the history they were witnessing. Every British monarch since William the Conqueror in 1066 had been crowned in this very building. They were part of a chain that stretched back nearly 1,000 years. The weight of that tradition was staggering. William sat tall and proud, watching his father with deep respect. Their relationship had been complicated over the years, but in this moment, all of that faded away. He saw only a man taking on the heaviest burden imaginable, and doing so with grace and dignity. Louis had grown quieter, perhaps sensing the importance of what was happening. He leaned against his mother, tired from the long ceremony. Kate wrapped her arm around him, grateful that he was managing so well despite his young age. The ceremony moved through its various stages, each one significant and steeped in symbolism. Charles pledged to serve his people, to uphold the laws of the land, and to maintain the traditions of the church. His voice was strong and clear, showing no signs of the nervousness he must have been feeling. As the coronation reached its conclusion, the congregation prepared for the final moments of the ceremony. Soon they would all process out of the abbey, and the newly crowned king would travel back to Buckingham Palace for the traditional balcony appearance. George rejoined his family, taking his seat between William and Kate. She put her arm around him and kissed the top of his head. He had performed his duties perfectly. The family sat together, united in this historic moment, ready for whatever would come next. The final prayers were said, and the Archbishop gave his blessing to the newly crowned king and queen. The organ began to play again, this time a triumphant, joyful piece that signaled the end of the ceremony. The mood in the abbey shifted from solemn reverence to celebration. People began to smile more openly, and a sense of relief mixed with happiness filled the air. Charles and Camilla, now officially crowned, stood from their thrones. They both wore their crowns, which caught the light beautifully with every slight movement. Charles held the orb in his left hand and the scepter in his right. He moved carefully, aware of the weight of both the physical regalia and the responsibility they represented. The processional out of the abbey began. This time, the newly crowned monarchs would lead the way. George and the other pages of honor took their positions once again, this time managing the train of Charles's imperial mantle as he walked. The young boys had practiced this moment endlessly, and their hard work showed in their careful, coordinated movements. Kate watched George with a mixture of pride and anxiety. She could see the concentration on his face, the way his brow furrowed slightly as he focused on his task. William squeezed her hand, sensing her concern. Their son was doing beautifully, but they both understood the pressure he was under. As the king and queen passed by their row, William and Kate bowed and curtsied respectively. Charlotte performed a perfect curtsy, just as she had practiced. She had been looking forward to this moment, and she executed it flawlessly. Louis attempted to bow, though his version was more of a quick head bob than a formal gesture. Still, the effort was adorable, and several people nearby smiled at his attempt. The processional moved slowly toward the abbey's exit. Other members of the royal family fell in line behind Charles and Camilla, creating a river of formal attire and sparkling jewels. William and Kate gathered their children and joined the procession. Charlotte held her mother's hand tightly, while Louis switched between holding his father's hand and trying to walk independently. As they moved through the abbey, Kate took in the faces of the guests. She saw foreign royalty, prime ministers, celebrities, and religious leaders from around the world. Each person represented a connection, a relationship, or a piece of history. The coronation was not just a British event, it was a global moment. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the abbey, mixing with the organ music and the distant sound of cheering from outside. Louis kept turning his head, trying to see everything at once. The stained glass windows painted colorful patterns on the floor as sunlight streamed through them. The flowers, the music, the people, it was all almost too much to take in. When they finally reached the entrance, the bright sunlight was almost blinding after the dimmer interior of the abbey. The roar of the crowd was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands upon thousands of people lined the streets, waving flags and cheering at the top of their lungs. The sound was like a physical force washing over them in waves. Charles and Camilla entered the Gold State coach, a magnificent carriage that had been used at coronations since 1762. The coach was gilded all over, covered in golden sculptures and decorations. 8 magnificent gray horses stood ready to pull it. The king and queen settled into their seats, their crowns still firmly in place. George was released from his duties and returned to his family. He looked exhausted but relieved. Kate pulled him close and whispered how proud she was of him. William ruffled his son's hair affectionately. George allowed himself a small smile, finally relaxing after the intense pressure of the ceremony. The Wales family was directed to their own carriage. While not as ornate as the Gold State coach, it was still impressively decorated and drawn by beautiful horses. William helped Kate up the steps, then lifted Louis into the carriage. Charlotte climbed up by herself, determined to show her independence. George followed last, moving with the weariness of someone who had just completed a marathon. Inside the carriage, the children pressed their faces against the windows. The crowds were incredible. As far as they could see in every direction, people filled the streets. Union Jack flags waved everywhere, creating a sea of red, white, and blue. Some people held banners with messages of congratulation and support. Others held up phones and cameras, desperate to capture this moment. The procession began its journey back to Buckingham Palace. The route had been carefully planned to pass through the heart of London, allowing as many people as possible to catch a glimpse of the newly crowned king. Military bands played as they passed, the music adding to the festive atmosphere. Soldiers in full ceremonial uniform lined the streets, standing at attention. William and Kate waved to the crowds continuously. Kate's arm began to ache, but she kept smiling and waving. This was what the people wanted, to feel connected to this historic moment, to feel seen by the royal family. She understood that responsibility and embraced it. Charlotte took to waving enthusiastically, copying her mother's graceful hand movements. She smiled broadly at everyone, clearly enjoying the attention and excitement. Some people in the crowd called out to her specifically, and she beamed with delight when she heard her name. Louis was fascinated by the soldiers. Every time they passed a group of guards in their distinctive uniforms, he pointed excitedly. He particularly loved the ones with the tall bearskin hats. William explained to him which regiments they were seeing, though Louis was more interested in how funny the hats looked than in military history. George waved more reservedly than his sister. He was tired, and the weight of what he had just done was settling on his shoulders. He thought about how perfectly he needed to perform, how many people had been watching him, and how one mistake could have been broadcast around the world. It was a lot for a 9-year-old to process. Kate noticed George's quietness and reached over to hold his hand. She didn't say anything, just let him know she was there. George squeezed her hand back, grateful for the comfort. He leaned his head against her shoulder just for a moment, before sitting up straight again. The procession passed landmarks that were familiar to millions around the world. They traveled down the Mall, the famous road leading to Buckingham Palace. The trees lining the street were filled with people who had climbed up for a better view. Others hung from lampposts and statues, determined to see the spectacle from every possible angle. As they moved through London, Kate thought about how different this was from the life she had known before marrying William. She had grown up in a normal middle-class family. Her childhood had been happy and simple, filled with ordinary moments and everyday joys. Now she was traveling through London in a horse-drawn carriage, watching millions of people celebrate a coronation, with her children beside her who would one day be at the center of all this themselves. The journey seemed to pass both quickly and slowly at the same time. Every moment was intense, packed with emotion and significance. Yet the route was long, and maintaining the constant smiling and waving required real effort. Louis started to slump against his father, the excitement finally wearing him out. William put his arm around his youngest son, supporting him while continuing to wave with his other hand. Finally, the golden gates of Buckingham Palace came into view. The carriage passed through the tall iron gates of Buckingham Palace, and suddenly the noise from the crowd was slightly muffled. The palace grounds provided a brief bubble of relative quiet, though the cheering could still be heard in the distance. The horses' hooves clattered on the palace driveway as they approached the grand entrance. Staff members lined up to greet them, all wearing their finest uniforms. The carriage came to a smooth stop, and a footman quickly appeared to open the door and lower the steps. William stepped out first, then turned to help Kate down. She gathered her dress carefully, making sure the delicate fabric didn't catch on anything. Charlotte practically bounced out of the carriage, her energy somehow renewed despite the long ceremony. George followed more slowly, his exhaustion evident in every movement. Louis had to be gently woken up by William. The little boy blinked sleepily, momentarily confused about where he was. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was buzzing with activity. Staff rushed about preparing for the next phase of the day, the famous balcony appearance. This was the moment when the royal family would step out onto the palace balcony to wave to the crowds and watch the military flyover. Millions of people were gathered in front of the palace and along the mall, all waiting for this traditional moment. The family was ushered into a private room to rest and prepare. Kate immediately checked on each child. She smoothed Charlotte's hair, which had gotten slightly mussed during the carriage ride. She straightened George's collar and made sure his medals were sitting properly. Louis was rubbing his eyes, still fighting off sleepiness. A staff member brought in refreshments. There were sandwiches, fruit, and juice for the children. Louis perked up immediately at the sight of food. He had been too nervous to eat much breakfast, and now his 5-year-old appetite was making itself known. Kate allowed him to have a sandwich and some strawberries, but not so much that he would get a stomachache. George sank into a chair, relief washing over him. His part in the ceremony was truly over now. He had managed to hold his grandfather's train without tripping, without dropping it, without making any mistakes. The pressure he had been carrying for weeks was finally lifting. William sat beside him and they talked quietly, father to son, about how well George had done. Charlotte twirled around the room, still full of energy and excitement. She was describing everything she had seen to anyone who would listen. The choir, the crown, the beautiful dresses, the carriage ride. Her words tumbled over each other in her enthusiasm. Kate smiled, charmed by her daughter's joy. Queen Camilla entered the room, still wearing her crown and formal robes. Despite the weight of what she was carrying, both literally and figuratively, she moved gracefully. She sought out the children immediately, praising George for his excellent work as a page of honor. George blushed at the compliment but looked pleased. Charles followed shortly after, though he had removed St. Edward's crown. That particular crown was so heavy that it was only worn during the ceremony itself. Instead, he wore the lighter imperial state crown. He looked tired but happy, the strain of the long ceremony evident on his face but mixed with satisfaction. The newly crowned king thanked William and Kate for their support and for raising the children to handle such public occasions so well. He spoke to each grandchild individually, making them feel special and appreciated. Louis, now more awake after eating, asked his grandfather if he could try on the crown. Everyone laughed, and Charles gently explained that the crown was very heavy and very precious and would have to wait until Louis was much older. A palace official appeared at the door, informing them that it was almost time for the balcony appearance. The family began making their way toward the front of the palace. The route took them through the grand corridors of Buckingham Palace, past portraits of monarchs from centuries past. Charlotte pointed at each painting, asking who they were. William patiently explained the lineage, the long history of their family. As they approached the balcony doors, the sound of the crowd grew louder again. Even through the thick palace walls, the roar of hundreds of thousands of people was unmistakable. Louis grabbed his mother's hand more tightly. The noise was enormous, almost frightening in its intensity. Kate knelt down to Louis's level. She explained that all those people were happy, that they were celebrating, and that there was nothing to be scared of. She told him that they would all be together, and that he just needed to wave and smile like he had been doing. Louis nodded, trying to be brave. Charlotte was practically vibrating with excitement. She had been looking forward to the balcony appearance almost as much as the ceremony itself. She knew that this was when the photographs would be taken, that would be in history books forever. She wanted to make sure she looked perfect. George was quiet again, processing everything that had happened. He thought about how his life was so different from other children his age. While his school friends would go home and play video games or ride their bikes, he had spent the day as a page of honor at his grandfather's coronation. Sometimes he wished for a more normal life, but he also understood that he had been born into something special, something meaningful. Other family members gathered near the balcony as well. The group had been carefully selected, including only working members of the royal family. Everyone took their designated positions, rehearsed multiple times in the days leading up to the coronation. William and Kate stood with their children close by. William placed a reassuring hand on George's shoulder. Kate held Louis's hand firmly. knowing he might try to wander or do something unpredictable in his childlike way. Charlotte stood between her parents and older brother, perfectly positioned and ready for her moment. An aide did a final check of everyone's appearance. Clothes were smoothed, hair was adjusted, and positions were confirmed. The timing had to be perfect. The military flyover was scheduled to the minute, and they needed to be on the balcony when the aircraft passed overhead. Charles and Camilla moved to the center position, the place of highest honor. Their crowns gleamed under the palace lights. Despite the long day, they both stood straight and tall, embodying the dignity and grace expected of monarchs. Kate took a deep breath. She could feel the anticipation building in everyone around her. This was one of the most photographed moments in royal history. Every expression, every gesture would be analyzed and discussed for years to come. She reminded herself to smile, naturally, to make sure the children were behaving, and to enjoy this extraordinary moment. The palace official gave a signal. It was time. The tall glass doors to the balcony were opened, and immediately the roar of the crowd increased tenfold. The sound was almost physical, a wall of noise that hit them as they stepped forward. One by one, the family members walked out onto the balcony. The crowd went absolutely wild. The view from the balcony was breathtaking and overwhelming all at once. As far as the eye could see, there were people. The mall was completely packed, a sea of humanity stretching into the distance. Red, white, and blue flags waved in waves like an ocean of national pride. The noise was deafening, a constant roar of cheering, singing, and celebration. Charles and Camilla stepped to the front of the balcony, and the crowd's reaction was incredible. Cheers erupted even louder, if that was possible. People jumped up and down, waved their flags frantically, and called out congratulations. The newly crowned king raised his hand in a wave, and the response was thunderous. William and Kate moved into position with their children. The moment they appeared, a fresh wave of cheers swept through the crowd. The Wales family was enormously popular, and the people were delighted to see them. Kate's elegant dress caught the sunlight beautifully, and photographers' cameras clicked continuously, capturing every moment. Charlotte waved enthusiastically, her face lit up with a huge smile. She had been born for moments like this, comfortable in the spotlight in a way that seemed natural and effortless. She waved with both hands at times, clearly thrilled by the massive response from the crowd. People in the crowd called out her name, and she beamed even brighter. George waved more formally, but there was a small smile on his face now. Seeing the joy of the people, understanding what this day meant to the nation, he felt a sense of pride that overrode his exhaustion. He stood tall beside his father, looking remarkably mature for his age. Louis was fascinated by the sheer number of people. His eyes were wide as he took it all in. Kate had to gently remind him to wave, and when he did, he used both hands in big, sweeping motions that made people laugh with delight. His childlike enthusiasm was infectious and endearing. The family stayed on the balcony for several minutes, waving continuously. Kate's arm ached, but she kept her smile bright and her waves graceful. She glanced at William, and they shared a look that communicated volumes. They had made it through this historic day. Their children had been magnificent. Everything had gone as well as they could have hoped. Louis tugged on his mother's dress and whispered something to her. Kate listened, then smiled and whispered back. William noticed and raised an eyebrow in question. Kate leaned over and quietly told him that Louis wanted to know when they could go inside because his hand was tired from waving. William chuckled softly. The comment a perfect reminder that despite all the ceremony and grandeur, Louis was still just a 5-year-old boy. The sound of aircraft engines began to grow in the distance. The RAF flyover was approaching, the grand finale of the coronation celebrations. The crowd's attention began to shift upward, people craning their necks to catch the first glimpse of the planes. On the balcony, everyone looked toward the sky. The timing was perfect. The Red Arrows, Britain's famous aerobatic display team, appeared first. Their red, white, and blue smoke trails painted the sky in the colors of the Union Jack. The sight was spectacular, and the crowd went wild with excitement. Louis pointed at the planes, his mouth open in awe. Charlotte clapped her hands together in delight. George watched with intense interest, fascinated by the precision of the formation. William explained quietly to the children about the different aircraft they were seeing. Following the Red Arrows came a formation of historic planes, including Spitfires and Hurricanes from World War II. These aircraft were reminders of Britain's resilience and history. Seeing them fly over Buckingham Palace during the coronation was deeply symbolic and moving. Finally, modern RAF jets screamed overhead in perfect formation. The noise was incredible, even drowning out the cheering crowd for a few moments. The raw power of the aircraft was impressive, a display of Britain's current military strength. The fly past lasted several minutes, each wave of aircraft bringing fresh cheers from the crowd below. As the last planes disappeared into the distance, Charles turned and waved one final time to the crowd. Camilla stood beside him, her hand raised in farewell. The other family members followed suit, giving the people one last wave before retreating back into the palace. The glass doors closed behind them, and suddenly they were in relative quiet again. The contrast was stark. Louis immediately slumped against his mother, the excitement and energy finally completely drained from his small body. Charlotte was still chattering excitedly about the planes and the crowds. George looked like he could fall asleep standing up. Palace staff immediately sprang into action, offering refreshments and showing people to rooms where they could rest. The official part of the day was over, though there would be more private celebrations that evening. For now, everyone needed a chance to decompress and recover from the intensity of the past several hours. Kate took her children to a private sitting room. She helped Louis out of his formal jacket and let him curl up on a sofa with a blanket. She sat beside Charlotte, listening to her excited retelling of every detail of the day. George sat quietly, processing his thoughts and experiences. William joined them after speaking briefly with his father. He loosened his collar and sat down heavily, the exhaustion finally showing on his face. He and Kate exchanged a long look, one that spoke of relief, pride, and the deep understanding that comes from sharing such significant experiences together. A staff member brought tea for the adults and hot chocolate for the children. Louis was already falling asleep, the hot chocolate sitting untouched beside him. Charlotte sipped hers while continuing to talk. George drank his slowly, staring into the distance with thoughtful eyes. As the afternoon light filtered through the palace windows, the family sat together in their private space. Outside, crowds were still celebrating in the streets of London. Parties would continue well into the night. But here in this quiet room, the Wales family was simply a mother, a father, and their 3 children, sharing a moment of peace after an extraordinary day. Kate looked at each of her children in turn. George, her serious and thoughtful eldest, who had performed his duties with such grace under pressure. Charlotte, her confident and joyful daughter, who had embraced every moment with enthusiasm. And Louis, her youngest, who had managed to behave remarkably well despite his age and the length of the day. William reached over and took Kate's hand. They had navigated this together as they did everything. The coronation was over and it had been a triumph. Their children had represented the family beautifully. The day would be remembered in history books, but for them, it was also a memory they would treasure as a family. As the palace settled into evening, and London continued to celebrate outside, the Wales family remained together. They talked quietly about the day, sharing observations and feelings. Louis slept peacefully. Charlotte's energy finally began to wane. George smiled more freely now that the pressure was off. They were part of history, but in this moment they were simply a family, bound together by love and shared experience. The coronation had been magnificent, but this quiet time together was perhaps even more precious. Tomorrow would bring new duties and responsibilities, but tonight they could simply be themselves, grateful for each other and for having successfully navigated one of the most significant days of their lives together.